Thank you for listening to this presentation on the importance of contention in social change. So this research is about studying the role of negative ties in online social networks. So I would like to start with the broad relevance of this research. So I'm sure that we are all very aware and grabbed by the current protests on racism and the demonstrations by Black Lives Matter. What this issue once again shows is that social change doesn't come about easily. There's always a lot of contention involved, disagreement between different groups in society with different, often opposing opinions. And people also express their negative attitudes towards people with opposite opinions. So we speak of polarization, and although polarization is a main interest of research, specifically this role of negative expressions, and particularly in large-scale online research, is not really taken into account. So in this presentation, I will therefore start with the key takeaways from current research on polarization, particularly large-scale studies using Twitter data. Then I will introduce our case study on Black Piet, which is a character of a Dutch tradition that has a racist connotation and has led to a lot of disputed debate in Dutch society. Then I will explain how we went about to include negative interactions, in our case, negative mentions on Twitter, into our study, into this debate. And then we will conclude with what we can learn from taking these negative mentions into account by comparing our assigned network, so our network with positive and negative ties, and comparing that to the retweet network. So I know that this is work in progress, and we do plan on comparing our assigned network also with other types of networks that can be constructed from the data to study polarization. But first, how has polarization been studied online? So computational social scientists have been studying the dynamics of polarization at scale using Twitter data, looking at important polarized debates such as Brexit or the fight for Catalan independence. These studies often find polarized group structures in the Twitter retweet data. So just a short recap, on Twitter you can express an opinion or share information in a limited set of characters, and then other users can retweet this, which is basically an act of sharing that tweet with your social network. So retweets are typically considered as endorsements, with a few exceptions of journalists who usually then explicitly add this to their bio by saying retweet is not an endorsement. But on Twitter, you can also mention others by adding an @ sign and then a username. And you can do that to specifically direct your message or part of your message to another user. So now, previous research that looked at mention networks was a little bit puzzled because there are not that many studies that actually do that. And when they do, it seems that the results are puzzling because the mention network do not show polarization. But what we noticed is that this research doesn't take into account the meaning of a mention. So a mention on Twitter is rarely a user just sharing some information with another user, as it is assumed by these former studies. A mention is often an act of agreement or disagreement. So previous research studying social conflict has not actually been taking into account negative relations explicitly. So we think there are two main reasons for that. So first is that Twitter doesn't provide functionality for a negative interaction directly. There is not a simple button. So this means that if you want to know the sentiment of a user interaction, you have to really look into the text. So that requires human interpretation. And that means it's a lot more effort to study than just looking at pre-given relations, such as retweets. Second, most analysis tools, such as network analysis methods, have not been designed for negative ties. And that's because these tools are developed in other fields, such as computer science, physics, where negative ties don't really have a meaning. You might have directed ties, weighted ties, but no negative ones. So there are very few tools available. For example, I've been trying to find a good network visualization tool for a large signed graph, and I haven't been able to find one. So if you watch this video, and if you do know one, please do reach out to me after this video. But so, as you see also in the slide on the right, some examples, mentions can clearly be positive, neutral, or negative. Now, before going into how we tackle this issue of including negative mentions and extracting the sign, I would like to present our case study on Black Piet. So Black Piet is a character of a Dutch national tradition of St. Nicholas, and the Black Piets are sort of his helpers. So Dutch white citizens dress up like this character at the national celebration day, the 5th of December, and paint their faces with blackface, put on red lipstick, and wear golden earrings. It's a very cherished tradition, and many people feel very strongly and emotional about it. But it has also led to massive protests of citizens pointing out the racist connotations. And that then has also led to counter-protests and a huge public ongoing debate. So I want to give a really short history of this character and the debate. So there's a lot to it that I cannot explain anything about, but the major thing that happened was in 2013, a demonstration was led by Quincy Gario and Jerry Afria, an anti-Black Pete demonstration, and they demonstrated at the National Day of Celebration itself and were also arrested for that. Since then, actually, the debate has really been spurred also online and specifically on Twitter. Many court cases have been taken place about this dispute, initiated actually by both pro and anti supporters. Another major thing in 2017, a group of white pro-Pete protesters actually blocked the highway in order to avoid anti-Black Pete protesters from coming into town and to protest. So although the discussion is still ongoing, and yet today is receiving yet another rush of attention, we do see that new public norms have started to arise. So, for example, we see that especially in the cities, they now no longer use Black Pete, but they use Pete with various colors, like blue, orange, etc. And many companies and stores avoid the Black Pete character on their products. Now, we want to see how groups in this debate form. And for that, we use Twitter data from 2017 and 2018. That also only include tweets that are about Black Pete. We matched on a set of keywords. So we have roughly 440,000 tweets, and these contain around 180,000 mentions. So I put some examples here on the slide of tweets, but they're in Dutch, so I leave it to the Dutch audience to look into them in closer detail. So now, how did we identify negative mentions and in general the sign of mention interactions? So we started off by manually labeling 10,000 tweets on 2 dimensions. So first we asked, is this tweet clearly expressing a pro or anti-Black Pete sentiment? Or is it perhaps expressing a neutral stance? Although we find that that occurred very little. Most tweets we had to label to ambiguous because it was too difficult to say with sufficient certainty how the tweet was intended by the user. Next, we labeled the mention sentiment for each mentioned user in the tweet separately, because some tweets can contain several mentions. So we asked whether this mention was clearly in agreement or expressing a positive attitude towards the mentioned user, or whether the mention was meant in opposition. Also here, we allowed for neutral and ambiguous mentions. Now, in order to classify the rest of the data, we applied a text machine learning algorithm developed by Facebook. It's called FastText. And we use pre-trained word embeddings trained on a Dutch Wikipedia corpus in order to teach the model the basics of the Dutch language. We downsampled the data both for issue and mention sentiment so that all classes were equally represented upon training to avoid a biased classification. Now, on this slide, you see the confusion matrix on the left. So the y-axis shows the true label and the x-axis shows the predicted label in the test set. The middle figure is this matrix, but normalized over the columns. So for example, of all mentions that we predicted as negative, 79% were indeed negative. The figure on the right shows the matrix normalized over the rows. Now these numbers are a little lower, and that's because we applied a simple rule to reduce the main errors that we care about. So what we did is, if the classifier was not very sure about a certain classification, we basically relabeled this to neutral. So we do that in order to reduce the main errors that we care about. So let me show a little bit more about that. So we care mostly about reducing the following errors. So once we have classified a mention as negative, how likely is it that that mention was actually positive? Or if we classified a mention as positive, how likely was it that that mention was in fact negative? And also, what is the probability of classifying a negative mention falsely as positive or classifying a positive mention falsely as negative? So those 4 numbers, as you can see, are very low. So we are happy with that. And I also point out that these numbers are actually based on 1 mention only. But many of the user-to-user interactions in our network will be based on several mentions. So then the accuracy of our model is even a little bit better. Okay, so overall, we have labeled 59% of the user-to-user interactions as neutral or ambiguous, so they will not occur in a network, 33% as positive, and 8% as negative. Okay, so now what do we learn from taking into account these negative relations in studying the Black Pete debate on Twitter? So what we did is to compare the retweet network with the signed network. So here on the left, you see the retweet network, and on the right, you see the signed network for the 5 largest groups in the network. So although these two graphs seem at first glance maybe a little bit similar, and definitely it looks like you see a polarized structure, we'd like to emphasize that on the left, the edges are retweets, so usually intended as agreement. And on the right, we only show the edges that are negative, colored in red. So although they seem alike, they are in many ways not. So here, this figure displays on the left the 14 largest communities in a retweet network, and then the 14 largest communities in a signed network and their relation. So what this shows is that, okay, many users, for example, of community 0, this is actually a community that has an anti-Black Pete sentiment, of the retweet network are also in this 0 community in the signed network. There are also a lot of users that are not. So literally all the diagonal lines in this image show the differences between the two networks. But in particular, we see that there are quite some users that in the retweet network are not part of the largest 14 communities, or might not even be part, actually some of them, in the retweet network at all, because they don't tweet or they are not retweeted. And they do take up important roles in the signed network. So here we see the top mentioned users and the top retweeted users and the way they have been, and the communities that they are part of in both networks. And again, you see there's quite some differences. But what is really interesting is also, again, there are some of these users that are important in the signed network, but that do not occur in the retweet network at all. So some examples are Jesse Klaver. So he's a politician, he's a leader of a left party, GroenLinks, but also our Prime Minister, Mark Rutte. And NOS, which is a public television station broadcasting the national children's event about the celebrations. So these are all figures that are really important in the signed network, but not present in the retweet network. So that brings me to the second conclusion of this research. So we see that the signed network reveals that there are actually some key public actors that are very central to this debate, also on Twitter, that you would miss if you would only look at the retweet network. So here again, some examples, nu.nl, ad.nl, RTL News, these are all media outlets that have received quite some negative attention on Twitter, but they are not present in the retweet network or take up a very uncentral role. Also interesting is the case of Het OM, which is the Dutch court. That is itself, of course, neutral, but it's not being retweeted as it doesn't tweet. But it does receive a lot of negative mentions, so it has a very central role in this debate. The third, the conclusion that we get from our comparison is that we see that in the signed network, some type of scapegoat role are being revealed. So these scapegoats are users that, or figures that receive a lot of negative attention from the opponents. For example, Jerry Afriye, so this was one of the main activists, has been receiving a lot of negative attentions from pro-Black Pete protesters. Also, Jesse Klaver, who we mentioned before, and the scapegoats for the anti-users are, for example, Jenny Douwes. So she was one of the main initiators of the road blockage, and Wierd Duck. So Wierd Duck is a journalist who is explicitly attacking and comparing the anti-Black Pete movement to the radical left. So I would like to conclude. We argue that contention is very important in social conflict. So if we study polarization, we must take into account negative ties. Twitter mentions are not simple acts of sharing information, but often carry positive or negative sentiments towards the mentioned user. Taking this sentiment into account is crucial in understanding the polarization processes that we try to study. So in this research, we showed that we can extract some of the negative positive polarity in mentions, and our resulting signed network reveals that these negative ties drastically influence the way groups are formed. Secondly, it brings to light the importance of certain central public figures in a debate that would have been missed if we look only at positive ties and retweets. Lastly, different roles emerge in the signed network, such as scapegoats that are being disproportionately attacked by users with opposite opinions. So this is work in process, and your feedback and suggestions are highly welcome. Please do reach out to me, and thank you very much for listening to this video.